going to talk about democratization of markets. I think this is a very topical issue which has been in the focus through 2011. We started off with the Arab Spring in the early 2011, and through 2011 we've experienced a European Union debt crisis, which really is at its root an issue around European Union integration. And more recently we've experienced the Occupy movement, both in the US and in different parts of the world. And to me, all three of these issues they're fundamentally related, and they have to do with the democratization of markets. So I'm going to focus on a pattern of sustainable progress, of organizational sustainable progress, which I'm then going to apply to explore the democratization of markets in greater detail. So this pattern is represented on different scale by very common phenomena. So the first phenomena I'm going to focus on is that of the growth of a seed into a flower. So when we look at this, what we see is a seed that goes through growth and culminates in the reality of a flower. When we analyze this, there are three distinct phases here. There is a phase in which we have a distinct isolated entity in which there is minimal change. We have a second phase in which there is growth, oftentimes assertive, irrational, adventurous, experimental growth. We have a third stage which reveals the meaning inherent in the seed, so it has to do with meaning and purpose. And these three phases, I'll refer to the physical phase, the vital phase, and mental phase. And this is a pattern of sustainable progress. We see it at the micro level in the growth of a seed into a flower. We see it at the macro level if we consider the sun, and if we consider the planet Earth orbiting around the sun and then revolving around its own axis. In that revolution, there are three distinct phases of the day that appear, and this has been going on for 4.5 billion years. So in this, again, in the phase one, we have the physical phase, in which as the sunlight hits the earth, there's a landscape which is revealed, in which it seems like there are many distinct isolated elements or entities which exist by themselves. So that's the physical phase. As the sun, relatively speaking, rises in the sky, what we see is all these separate elements or entities beginning to interact and move around a lot more. So that's represented by the vital phase. And then as the sun, relatively speaking, begins to set in the sky, there are stars that appear, and in that multiple point of view, anything that happened during the day can be thought of and introspected on in a very different way, which is akin to the mental phase. So what we see is the same pattern of movement through the physical to the vital to the mental, occurring at a micro level and occurring at a macro level. And any system in which you have the same pattern occurring at a micro and a macro level is a fractal system. So this gives us insight into the nature of the system in which we live. It's a fractal system, and it's the basis of many of our organizations that exist in practical life. Now, these organizations have a distinct makeup, and that makeup is comprised of these three elements or building blocks: the physical, vital, and mental. Now it's possible for the physical, vital, and mental elements to combine in many different ways. So you have, for instance, you may have any one of the physical, vital, or mental element that leads how an organization functions. There may be, again, the physical, vital, or mental that follows, and there may be, again, the physical, vital, mental that follows this element. So there are many different combinations. So for instance, if you have, say, an orientation where there's emphasis on the status quo or minimal change, and you use, for instance, an energetic or a lot of assertiveness to assure that this status quo remains, and you use a lot of rationality in thought to ensure that this energy that supports the status quo is maintained. So what you have here is a pattern where the physical leads and the vital and mental are subservient to it. So there are many different combinations that are possible, as you can see from this. I'm not going to go into all of these, but you can get a sense for the different play. The bottom line being that organizational dynamics are entirely determined by the way in which the physical, vital, and mental elements combine together. So these become like DNA, and as in the way in which they combine is going to entirely determine the dynamics of an organization. Now, I'll go on to say that there is one particular pattern, however, that yields sustainable progress. And that pattern, from all the possibility of patterns, that pattern is where you have the mental orientation leading and the vital and the physical really being subservient to it. So we see this in the way that, for example, the seed becomes a flower, and that's why I call this a universal pattern of sustainable progress. But to illustrate how this pattern plays out in so many different places, let's consider, say, a person. A person might have a movement of anger, and anger is, if we think about it, is a self-referencing flow at the vital level. And if the person's psychology is such that they always are exercising this movement, then there's going to be a level of dysfunction that animates their lives. However, if they complete the pattern for sustainable progress, that means that they are able to apply reason or the mental light to a vital situation and then move out of this dysfunctional pattern. So in exercising this pattern of sustainable progress, the physical yielding to the vital, yielding to a mental orientation, they have been able to change the way that they interact with the world. Now we'll see this kind of pattern as we look at some of these movements that I think are really heading towards a democratization of markets. We'll see where exactly in this fractal pattern they exist. So for example, consider the Occupy movement. When we think about this, and if we think about this pattern of sustainable progress, where we are here is markets are fundamentally at what I call the vital level. So there's a lot of perhaps irrational growth, a lot of orientation around a small conception of self as opposed to a comprehensive conception of self or comprehensive expression of markets. And what the Occupy movement, it's really pushing for us to move